pleasure to welcome you all to discuss with us how we can overcome barriers to social dialogue in supply chains. This is the first webinar in a series of 3. So the next will be held on the 1st of June, and then we will focus on gender. And the third and the final webinar will be held on the 22nd of June on due diligence. One of the issues that the Global Deal seeks to address is how to achieve social dialogue in global supply chains. This is quite a challenge for many different reasons. First of all, because many suppliers are found in the informal economy. Labor market institutions tend to be weak, and enforcement of labor law might be poor as well. That said, legislation can also be an obstacle if workers are not allowed to organize. And quite often trade unions are weak, and sometimes they are fragmented as well. And then there is also the fact that there is a surplus of labor, which makes it more difficult for workers to negotiate higher wages. But employers' associations are also quite weak. Many companies do not join an employers' organization. And then there is the whole additional dimension of international brands versus suppliers. Their relationship is sometimes described as an asymmetric power relation because suppliers have a limited influence over pricing, which raises questions regarding the role of international brands in relation to social dialogue. And these are the issues that Fairwear Foundation and Cornell University have been working on together in a project called Social Dialogue in the 21st Century. And it's also part of the commitment that Fairwear Foundation made when they joined the Global Deal. So they committed to a two-year project that identifies structural barriers to effective social dialogue in supply chains in the garment industry, as well as measures that can help to overcome these barriers. And that brings me to our first presentation. And I'm really delighted to introduce Jason Judd, who is the Executive Director of New Conversations Project, which is a project about improving global labor practices. And he is with the Industrial and Labor Relations School at Cornell University. And now Jason will present the findings from that project, Social Dialogue for social dialogue in the 21st century. So now I'm going to hand over to Jason for our first presentation. I believe you have a PowerPoint to share with us.
I do, yeah. So, thank you, Veronica. Thank you to the OECD and the Global Deal, and our partners in this work over the last couple of years, the Fairway Foundation and 2 Dutch unions, FNV and CNV. What I thought I'd do is share the work that was done by our team at Cornell University in our project, which focuses on labor practices in global supply chains, and by a network of researchers all around the world, including Alex Covarrubias, who's going to speak today. We were invited by the Fairway Foundation and their partners to look at social dialogue practices in the apparel industry, specifically in 10 countries. So there's an awful lot of material. You can find it all on the New Conversations website, all 10 reports and the synthesis report. So all I can share with you this morning is sort of a high-level view, what we were able to glean in commissioning and editing and packaging, synthesizing these 10 reports across 10 really very, very different countries. And we'll focus first on the obstacles. What are the obstacles to social dialogue in the apparel industry? And I thought we could begin with the definition. Let me share my screen. Good. So social dialogue, defined by the ILO, is what in the US we'd call a big tent. You can get everybody inside there. It includes practically every form of conversation, negotiation, consultation, bargaining, dispute prevention and resolution, workplace cooperation, almost every sort of interaction between workers, employers, governments, buyers fits in this big tent. On the right, though, are the preconditions for what the ILO calls sound social dialogue. And there you see the tent get a lot smaller, a lot faster. A precondition for sound social dialogue includes strong, independent employers organizations and worker organizations with the necessary technical capacity, access to relevant information, that's key, political will at all levels, respect for fundamental rights. You can imagine the tent shrinking rapidly. This list of preconditions for sound social dialogue reminds me a little bit of the preconditions for an efficient market. Economists tend to describe the market very broadly, but the preconditions for an efficient market are radically limiting. So in looking at these 10 countries, we by necessity had to develop a typology to describe the way first the state engages in social dialogue, and we've divided the 10 countries into these 4 types. And because the reports were written mostly last year, there have been some changes. You see under fluctuating for the state role in social dialogue, which means a little bit of this, a little bit of that, up and down. Ethiopia and Myanmar both engaged in strife, repression, verging on war. Things have changed radically in both places over the last 4 to 6 months. But fluctuating describes the state sort of dipping in and out of social dialogue. Polarized describes typically the relationship between the government and unions. And we describe the social dialogue role of the state in Cambodia and Indonesia as typically polarized. But you see Cambodia appearing in both polarized and subsidiary. Subsidiary to us means the relationship between the state and the unions is, well, subsidiary. That is, unions are often working at the behest of the ruling party, or by extension, employers. And in Cambodia, we see a bit of both polarized and subsidiary. And then cooperative, we found Bulgaria and Honduras to be relatively cooperative. That means that the interactions between the state and unions and employers was substantive, cooperative, not always amicable, but generally productive. Now, even where the state role is, for example, polarized, you can find effective social dialogue at the factory level. So in the papers, we're looking at the factory level, the sectoral level, the national level. And what we found in research for another project by the New Conversations Project is that there's a strong relationship between the presence of a union and collective bargaining at the factory level and overall labor compliance. So when we talk about private regulation, for example, and the interest of global buyers in labor compliance at the factory level, we want to see what we see here under unions with CBAs, a relatively high labor compliance rate. At the other end of this table, where there is no union present at the factory level and there's no collective bargaining agreement, you see that the labor compliance score is a full 10 points, 10% lower. And that's significant, because in that 10% could be all manner of violations. So the takeaway here is that at the factory level, the presence of a union, a bona fide activist union, and a collective bargaining agreement means labor compliance is, on the whole, higher. So that's for us an enormously important finding. The problem is that comes from a relatively small sample that was based on Better Work data. And when we look, which covers 8, now 9 countries, when we look globally at the state of social dialogue, or more specifically, freedom of association, here in this heat map from the ITUC, we see that there is sort of a supply problem. Workers in many of these places, those in red and orange, are unable to organize unions. Their organizations are not free from interference by employers or government. This is compounded, again, research from a related project, but appearing in the social dialogue reports. This is compounded by the sourcing choices that brands make. In a survey of a handful of the leading global brands, here it's Gap, Primark, and H&M, we found that more than half of their sourcing by country comes from countries that appear in red or in orange on that ITUC heat map. In other words, a lot of the sourcing done by the brands comes from countries where freedom of association is either not a thing, as in China, or it's as we say here, on the rocks. It's bumpy. Bangladesh is a good example of that. So it's one thing to say, as we do in the report, that freedom of association and collective bargaining at the factory level leads to better results. It's another thing to say that that's easily achieved across the globe, because we see that there are many countries where apparel production is concentrated that workers are unable to organize for either de jure or de facto reasons. Another obstacle is the difficulty, well, two difficulties. One, the difficulty that auditors have, factory auditors, whether they're working in-house for brands or they're working for a third party, the difficulty they have in seeing and counting violations of freedom of association. So if we take freedom of association as an important proxy, an important measure of the willingness and the ability of workers and employers to engage in social dialogue, we see that auditors struggle to pick up on it in audits. In the pie chart in this slide, you'll see that this data comes from a major North American retailer. In their audits over a 7-year period, most of the findings are focused on things that are relatively easy to see and easy to count. So OSH, occupational safety and health, is relatively easy to see and count. Freedom of association, on the other hand, and I can include in that core labor standards generally, but freedom of association is relatively hard to see, and as a result, it shows up very little in findings for their audits. The other difficulty, the second, is that suppliers, often taking their lead from buyers, don't put a lot of emphasis on freedom of association. They either don't have experience with it, either in the country in which they're working or wherever they come from. Management is often coming from somewhere else. For example, in my experience in China, in Cambodia, much of the management and ownership, almost all of it, comes from China, where there is no emphasis on freedom of association, and managers bring with them that tradition. So there's both a lack of interest, capacity, and incentive on the part of suppliers to engage organized workers, and it's difficult for relatively difficult for auditors to pick up on those violations. So how is this changing? We went to trade data to get a feel for what was changing in trade patterns, and this is sort of a sister graph to the ITUC heat map. If you follow this graph over this 19-20 year period, you see a change in the imports to the European Union of apparel and footwear from the top 10 or so countries, and you see in red China dominates through the middle of this period, 2010, 2011, when Chinese production and Chinese imports to the EU were at their height. They were 40 to 50% of all imports to the European Union, and that's begun to decline, though not radically. They still account for more than a third of imports to the European Union. And that holds true for the Americans. When we look at a similar graph, you'll see that with the exception of a couple of the outliers, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Turkey, they all play different roles in these two markets, the European Union and the US. China is still the largest, but the growth in places like Bangladesh and Vietnam mean that, to the extent that freedom of association is either a thing in those places or maybe becoming a thing in those places, signaled perhaps by Vietnam's ratification of Convention 98, then there is a small opening for freedom of association that you don't see where China dominates production and imports, both the European Union and the US. This is what the graph looks like for the United States. It's a different mix of countries, and the numbers differ a little, but China's role is the same in both markets. Okay. So maybe a small opening, but in the last year, in the COVID crisis, we saw imports, imports of apparel, both to the US and the European Union, collapsing effectively in both these places early in the year and ticking up towards the end of the year. Many of these major exporters ended up more or less where they began the year, but they're all, with one exception, under their month-on-month levels for 2020. So this means additional pressure on suppliers and therefore on workers in terms of the availability of orders, the regularity of orders, and of course, price. So what does that mean for social dialogue? Well, to the extent that suppliers' willingness to engage in social dialogue is a function of their economic performance, then it means that greater pressure on suppliers and hence workers means less incentive to engage in social dialogue. And in writing these reports in the last year, all of the researchers in the group went back and took a look at what's changed in the last year. How has the COVID crisis changed or stressed social dialogue over the last year? And we treat it as sort of a stress test of the health of social dialogue in each of these 10 countries. And we developed a slightly different typology for that. Functional, where the governments, employers, and workers were able to engage one another and reach policy consensus, sometimes a little rough, on what the response to COVID should be. You'll see again Ethiopia and Myanmar appearing there. In both places, it's no longer fair to describe the relationship between the government and unions as functional. Ritualistic in a handful of places where the parties sort of went through the motions, but there wasn't substantive policy debate, and there wasn't consensus that included, for example, important contributions on the part of the unions. And then third, opportunistic, three places where the government used the crisis as an opportunity to change in fundamental ways labor law and to advance typically the interests of suppliers over those of workers. Okay, just a couple of last points. This one on the relationship between social dialogue, trade, and public regulation. We found in writing the paper that the role of trading partners, and by extension the global buyers, was enormously important. That where trade partners were clear about what the standards were for social dialogue and for respect for labor rights more generally, there was a reaction, good or bad, but a reaction from the national government and from the employers. And I use here the example of Cambodia. It's one of the 10 countries covered in these reports. And here we saw the European Union and brands, both in the US and the European Union, getting clearer over time about what they expected to see in terms of freedom of association, the legal framework, and more generally, respect for democratic processes. And this, combined with changes over the last year in trade policy in the EU and more obviously in the United States with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement that I think Alex may talk about, and changes with regard to import of cotton from China. We see a tightening over time of expectations by the trading partners, typically the US and the European Union, for respect for labor rights. And we'll be interested to see how the mechanisms in the new NAFTA agreement change the way parties there think about the importance of social dialogue. All 10 reports are on the website. Before I wrap up and hand it back to Veronica, I thought I'd run through one more time what we think the main obstacles to social dialogue are, and then in the back and forth we can talk about what works to improve it. First, and most importantly, the fundamental and chronic power imbalances between workers and suppliers in the global apparel industry. That doesn't always hold true at the factory level. There are, of course, factories where workers and employers are engaged in meaningful social dialogue. There's freedom of association and collective bargaining. But when we look at the industry as a whole, we see in the aggregate there's this structural imbalance between the power of workers and suppliers, and then the structural imbalance between the power of suppliers and their buyers, where the conversation between the two, the relationship is still often built around price and social dialogue, respect for freedom of association, engagement in collective bargaining at the factory level is still seen as an extra, and on the part of some suppliers as a cost. So that's one. One is the imbalance in power. The second would be problems with the legal framework, where freedom of association is just not a thing, either in law or in effect, in practice. That's another major and longstanding obstacle. A third is the supply problem. I talked about this at the top. The supply of employers, of apparel and footwear suppliers who are amenable, who are open to a relationship with organized workers. That number is relatively small. And on the other side, the number of unions that have majority status, that are independent or at least activist and ready to engage in collective bargaining at the factory level, also a relatively small number. So the overlap between those two is pretty small. And then finally, sourcing. This is incredibly important. Where buyers decide to buy tells us a lot about the relative importance of freedom of association in their scheme of things. Veronica?
Thank you so much, Jason. This was a really good overview. I think we have a better idea now of how things look in different countries, and also you stressed these different obstacles, which I think would be very useful for our discussion today. Now I would like to turn to our panel. We will have 2 rounds of questions. In the first round, we will ask questions which are related to the challenges and the obstacles to social dialogue. And then in the second round, we will focus on the solutions. What can we do together to achieve social dialogue, to strengthen social dialogue? So we will continue now with looking more at trying to identify the problems, and then we will discuss what we can do about it. So I'm now very pleased to welcome Alex Covarrubias Valdenbro, who is a research professor at the College of Sonora in Mexico. He's also chairman of Innovation and Labor Network of the Mexican automobile industry. We're going to start now looking specifically at Mexico. And Mexico is one of the countries that has ratified all the fundamental conventions of the ILO. And the labor law in Mexico actually provides a higher level of protection for workers compared to some other countries of the OECD, for example. But the question is, how does it look in practice, especially when it comes to the right to organize and to bargain collectively? So Alex, do you agree with the picture that Jason has painted? Is this what you see in Mexico as well? Alex, you need to put the mic on.
Yeah. Thank you, Veronica, and all the crew from OECD, Cornell, ILR, NCP, and the Fairwear Foundation crew. And thank you everyone for being here. And okay, just first to start with a little background about Mexico. And I will say that Mexico has never had a real industrial relations system where management and labor freely engage and negotiate each other. It has this kind of structure, highly intervened labor relations, state lead system. Organized labor has been the missing angle in this system. And because of that, the institution of labor has been mere window dressing, I will say. Is a kind of, I agree in this point with Jason's picture, it's ritualistic, but I call it mere window dressing. There are many things going on right now in Mexico. However, yes, Mexico has higher labor protection standards, but they hardly have been enforced. But yeah, with this center-left president coming into office 2 years ago, in the new NAFTA, the so-called USMCA, things start to move dramatically in many respects. There is a new labor law emphasizing the right to organize. In all the ILO fundamental conventions, there are this kind of minimum wages hikes, and a mandate to legitimate all the collective bargaining agreements in place, and a mandate for unions to accommodate transparency, democracy, and gender equality. Which is most important, there is this second, I call it the second generation of US trade arrangement, to including binding mechanisms to enforce labor rights. This is never happened before in the history of US free trade agreements with Latin American or even with other countries beyond America. This includes rapid response mechanisms, panel of expert mechanisms, and even individual workers' possibility to denounce and complain for any labor violations taking place in any plant, any factory. So right now, for instance, there are two major cases running on just in the last 2 weeks. One of them is the GM case, and another one is Tridonex. It's also auto parts industry, but the important thing in this last case is that it belongs to the Matamoras case, where this Susana Prieto, probably some of you hear about it, start a labor movement 2 years ago and was imprisoned, and after a massive protest, and was released. So in these 2 cases, the problem is the same. People is trying to legitimate the collective bargaining and take the opportunity to replace the traditional CTM corporative protection contract, we call it union, and they respond as business as usual, meaning firing, harassing, repressing workers, even with the support of plant managers. And in both cases, the rapid response mechanisms has been starting to work. So 2 main lessons from this takeaway from this short background and situation, I will say, are the next. First, for social dialogue to work, an industrial relations system need to be in place, a system where the 3 angles work together. And second, in emerging, less developed countries as Mexico, which has been based on social dumping policies of cheap, precarious work and no compliance of labor rights as Mexico, the change has to come from outside first, then move to consolidate the institutions of labor. But they need, in the case of Mexico, and I guess in many cases, this kind of big bang explosion is need to put in place and coming from outside. I leave it like I leave it here, and I will continue in the next round. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Alex. I think we will come back to several of the issues you mentioned, and particularly this new legislation. It will be very interesting to hear about this and how it might change social dialogue in Mexico. But now I would like to introduce our next speaker. We are going to turn to Cambodia. I'm very pleased to welcome Atit Kong, who is the president of the Coalition of Cambodian Apparel Workers Democratic Union. And this is a union that represents about 26,000 garment workers in Cambodia. So, Atit Kong, what are the obstacles to social dialogue that you experience as a trade union in Cambodia, and what are the reasons for these obstacles?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for inviting Sikadu or me as a representative for this event. So I think it became quite popular, the word social dialogue around the world, but you know, in Cambodia we also try, I mean, both government, I mean, social partner and the trade union, we try to obtain, we try to exercise it, we try to learn and try to benefit from it for quite some time. So I think for my experience, first is the strength of the employer organization, and the strength of the worker organization is not there at the moment. Like, I think in the presentation of Jason has touched a bit on that. So I'm quite agree on that, because now if you look at the employer association, they are more in the level of opportunistic, like they are in a strong position, so, and they got what they want, at least not very satisfied at the highest level, but they are at their own average level that the employers group has acquired for all this year. So, you know, if you look at the history of the minimum wage since the year of 2000 to 2005 to 2010, so the minimum wage can only increase every 5 years. Nobody touched. So it was very, very favorable to the employer organization. And this is one of the example that I want to express about the opportunistic position of the employer organization. And I mean, so for the side of the worker, so we are been at the area of a lot of harassment. So we are in the, you know, very quite messy situation. So we need to work. So the barrier is we need to really bring this both representation of the employer organization and the union organization to a level of they can decide. They are not very, you know, based on the opportunistic and based on, you know, short term. So now it's very much based on the short term issue. So from the worker side, they all, I mean, if you talk like about social dialogue with them, they will laugh, they will smile, and they will really things like, oh, what, you know, they will take years. They will think, oh, how many years, like 5 years. If we complain to the ILO, or if we complain to things, so will take how many years, they will think in their own question mark, you know, bubble. So this is a situation now, block the genuine social dialogue, and worker usually use the short-term way. They also want to go on strike because they want things that to go fast. They want things to be a quicker result from them, which is, you know, I mean, how much can they patient for? I mean, how much can they wait? Because their food only lasts for 1 week, right? So their reserve only lasts for 1 week. So that's why if they go on strike, they only last for 1 week, and if they wait, I mean, they have no choice. So that's why we always use that. So I mean, the ILO and the union, so like specialists from my union, we work with different organizations like, you know, ILO, Fairwear, and CNV, and all the things. So we quite strongly promote the social dialogue, and we believe that the sustainability way for us, for both sides to go forward. So, and the other side is the political agenda, like the government, the political issue. So now here in Cambodia, I mean, there is a space that they open. If the government do not open, so then it's very hard to exceed and to go beyond that, to grow better. So then sometimes the trade union, you know, we risk our life to break that barrier of you know, of what you call a limit, what you call a red line that the government have set. So, you know, so because we want to grow our powers to the level of equal and good faith bargaining. So in order to do so, we have to have a strong, you know, representation. We have to get the negotiation table at the national level, and we have to get the employer to sit in the negotiation table in a good faith way. So we can't get that. Most of the time we can't get that from the government. So we have to fight the government. And other side, in the government sector, we have a lot of experience that we really get the brand to be involved. So that called the experience. So if you look at the genuine CBA in Cambodia, I would say not even 10%, you know, the genuine CBA that we succeed in the last 20 years. So that's why this is the barrier that we are working on. And I think we, at the moment, to be short, we are not very really convinced about the social dialogue that we has been worked for the last 20 years, and especially in the late about 8 to 10 years that we quite familiar with this platform, you know. But even we have a broader perspective or perception that this is the future, but still we need to convince majority of our member that this is the long-term way, and this is the sustainability way that the union, and we need to work with different party to show them to our member. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kong. And I think it was very good that you also highlighted this, the long-term perspective, because that is one of the arguments we are trying to make, that everybody benefits from social dialogue in the long-term perspective, but that might not always be obvious for everybody. Now, as you had seen from the agenda, we wanted to have a speaker from each stakeholder group so that everybody is represented. You have seen we have heard now from Cornell University, we've just heard from the trade unions, we have heard from the professor from Mexico. We were now supposed to have a speaker from PT Pan Brothers, which is Indonesia's largest garment manufacturer, producing for international brands, Anna Patricia Sutanto, but I can't see her in the meeting, so I think she hasn't joined us yet. She's actually not in Indonesia, so she is in the US, so it's very, very early morning. It's late in the evening in Asia, it's early in the morning in the US, so maybe she will be able to connect a bit later, because I think it would be very interesting to have the perspectives of all these different groups. So what I would suggest is that we now turn instead to Suit Supply, to Joy Ruter Dink, who is the head of corporate social responsibility at Suit Supply, which is a European tailoring brand, and they are also a member of the Fairwear Foundation. I'm very pleased, Joy, that you were able to be with us today, and you will tell us a little bit about the role of brands, and in particular, how can brands support social dialogue if workers are not organized, or if there is no collective bargaining, for example, taking place? So how can brands support social dialogue?
Yeah, thank you, Veronica, and I'm really glad to be in this meeting and to have this discussion with all these valuable players. I think these discussions are extremely valuable, and we should have a lot of those and more of those. Yeah, so social dialogue is a very, very important topic, and I think as well also for brands. It's already, as mentioned also before, for example, by Jason, that brands don't really prioritize social dialogue and freedom of association and find it very difficult topics to work on. It's not really showing up in audits either. And even if it does, it's a very complex matter to solve. Yeah, I'm here today to hopefully convince some brands in this meeting that it is worthwhile to invest in this topic, and also for brands themselves, actually. So we Suit Supply, we really think that workers are really best placed to advocate for their own rights. But again, in order for this to happen, they really need to have the space to express their voices and to organize themselves, to form unions or join unions, committees, other representation bodies, etc. Yeah, and this really is where indeed social dialogue and freedom of association come in. And what we really feel is that this specific ILO standard is almost like an enabler, meaning that when in place and implemented functionally or relatively well, it can actually really empower workers and also their employers to basically implement and solve problems together, and often without even any intervention from outside. So I think short-wise is really worthwhile for brands as well that are working on CSR and want to make sure that their supply chains are fair and stable workplaces. Working on this ILO standard means that you improve all other ILO standards. Jason already showed you guys some numbers from Better Work, and I've also taken a look at our supply chain, where a relatively high number of factories is or unionized or has other bodies in place. And we find in our supply chain that on average, even if we only look at audit findings, which again don't show everything, but they are a good indicator. I said on average, we have around 15 findings that we need to work on with a factory if we look at our total supply chain. But if we look at factories that are organized and functionally organized to some extent, instead of 15 average findings, we have only 5. So basically a third of what we have to work with compared to other factories where, you know, freedom of association or social dialogue in general is not really functioning. So to be really blunt, it also saves a lot of work. Yeah, it's definitely shows in the numbers. And what does it look like working on social dialogue? Well, I mean, it can look like a lot of different things. It's important to understand that there's a lot of elements involved before workers can effectively organize. And there's also in a lot of places and a lot of things where brands don't really have a lot of influence. Brands alone cannot make it happen, obviously, but brands can, however, play a hugely important role in taking away some of the barriers towards social dialogue, and especially on factory level where that leverage takes place and where you have the relationships with the factory. Therefore, we focus mostly on factory level dialogue as a way sort of to manage conflict and to support a stable and fair workplace. And yeah, I've listed a few things where I think that every brand that wants to work on this topic or feels they should start working on this topic could start with, in my opinion, almost today. So one is providing access to remedy through functioning grievance mechanisms, basically meaning that workers should have a place to go in case there's any issues. The most important one should be the internal grievance mechanism, so in a factory. But I feel that most brands should also provide workers with an external grievance mechanism, meaning there's a poster up with, for example, a number that they can call or can email, and they should also get training on this as well. And what you really see is that by providing workers with a access to remedy, things can actually start moving, and social dialogue on factory level can really start happening. I think it's really important to manage or to mention there that I feel complaints as they are called by us, are actually positive rather than a negative. So I don't think they should be viewed that way. And I think it should also be very clearly mentioned and communicated to the factory that they should be a positive thing, because it really shows that workers know where to seek remedy. And it's also, especially in the case of the external one, a way for workers to reach you as a brand directly, which, through language barriers, there's of course a lot of issues with that. And it's kind of an opportunity for you to work with your factory to really improve the internal mechanism and to see if there's also more openings on how that could look and if that could be much better organized. So basically I always tell factories, once the internal grievance mechanism works well, the external one is kind of there for show, but it is important that it controls the internal one. And it creates opportunities to make things better. So that's one, so grievance mechanisms. I feel a second one would be try to involve workers as much as you can in your CSR work in factories on both social and environmental. Again, language barriers could be an issue, but really try to work worker-centric, involve them in audit meetings, share local language caps with them, involve them in complaint solving. They are an asset to you, they're an asset to the factory, and the more that their talent and their insight is utilized, the more relationships will start to form, trust starts to build, and people actually start to have conversations with each other. And I think a third is, where possible, involve local stakeholders. You don't operate in a vacuum. I feel a lot of brands are not sharing a lot of their work or their issues, their struggles with other brands or other local players. And I think it's really important that we should not be afraid to ask for help. There's a lot of local experts out there, and you'd be surprised how many of them would be super into helping you with any issues that you might face in the factory that you work with. This can be, for example, NGO, can be a trade union, can even be another factory that has done amazing work on this. We as Food Supply really use these stakeholders to help us understand the local context and also to help us provide training and education to both workers and employers. So that would be my 2 cents.
Thank you so much, Joy. And thank you also for highlighting some examples of what can be done. These concrete examples I think are really useful. Now I would like to turn to our last panelist, Tina Rogers. She's the coordinator on social dialogue and external relations at Fairwear Foundation. And we're very pleased to have you here. You will tell us a little bit about how you work with your 128 member brands to promote decent work and social dialogue in the garment industry. And I would like to ask you, what are the most important obstacles to social dialogue in global supply chains?
Sure. Thanks, Veronica, and to the Global Deal for hosting this session. You'll probably hear some repetition of the previous speakers and what I'm going to say, but it's also really based on our experience working with our member brands and in various production countries throughout the globe. So in terms of barriers, I think first and foremost, like others have said, the lack of respect and protection for freedom of association and collective bargaining is really key. And as Jason explained, these rights are basically under attack in every country in the world, and particularly in a lot of the garment producing countries. And functional social dialogue really cannot take place without workers having these rights. Social dialogue, which does not involve democratically elected worker representatives, is not social dialogue. So we need a much stronger focus on promoting and protecting these rights, and by all members of the supply chain, which means that all the actors in the supply chain really need to understand the benefits as well as social dialogue for workers and also for business in the long term, as Joy highlighted just in her speech there. Second barrier, and really related to these rights, is the lack of support in global supply chains for unions and their role. So despite the fact that we see through the New Conversation Project's research and analysis that where unions and CBAs are in place, compliance increases on all other labor rights. And Joy just explained the same from their supply chain as well. But the value of unions still seems to be questioned at a lot of levels. So in some places, workers themselves are mistrustful of unions, employers are hesitant to engage at best, and many brands underestimate the value as well. So we collectively need to strengthen unions, their capacity, their role, their value for workers, and really promote this not only in policy, but also, again, with all actors in the supply chain to take that role up. There's work, of course, needed inside the union movement itself, and Atit spoke to this as well, with strengthening the unions, but also by all the actors who have made commitments on paper to freedom of association, for example, in their code of conducts, or suppliers committing to this with their buyers as well. So a third barrier that we see strongly in supply chains is the lack of capacity and willingness to engage by suppliers. And Jason touched on this as well. It showed up in the research, and this is experience of many of our member brands as well. So it's a major barrier to factory level social dialogue, because obviously, as implied by the name, dialogue must involve both parties. So if management aren't willing to engage, or simply don't know how to do so in an effective way or a productive way, workers and unions are also stuck. They can't engage, they can't move forward. So this is partly about shifting management attitudes towards unions and dialogue, but it's also about building the capacity of factory management to be able to engage in good faith social dialogue at a real level. I mean, factory management is there, and they're trained on perhaps managing production lines and producing garments, but they don't necessarily have the skills to engage in dialogue. And we also can't expect that without proper support and training. So they need training on that. But in order to do both of those things, to change attitudes and to build capacity, factory management needs time and finances, which they likely don't have. They're constantly being pushed, usually by their buyers, to produce faster, cheaper, and better, and comply with all the labor standards as well. So that's hard for suppliers to do. So there's this lack of capacity and willingness to engage, but it's because it's very difficult also at the supplier level. But this relates then to what I think the fourth barrier is, and that's about brand practices. So freedom and association and collective bargaining are really not areas that most brands know well. And as Jason and Joy shared, this isn't their area of expertise. So often inadvertently, their practices are contributing to repressing freedom of association and social dialogue. So for example, the sourcing strategy of a brand rarely includes a serious examination of freedom of association. So most sourcing decisions are based on price or quality of product. Maybe there's an overall labor rights score that they look at. But if a brand doesn't include this in their sourcing strategy, and they are sourcing then from a country where freedom of association is restricted, or are working with a supplier with no trade union or elected worker representatives, they're contributing to the idea that that's okay, that repressing these rights, that not having these in place are okay. And then even if a well-intentioned brand then wants to support the supplier and workers in improving social dialogue at that factory, if there's no protection for freedom of association or no culture in engaging in dialogue, it's going to be very difficult to get those things in place. You're starting sort of way at the bottom at that factory. And that's based on poor sourcing decisions, or sourcing decisions that didn't prioritize or take into account freedom of association. And that's just one example of brand practices. It could also be poor production planning by brands, which leads to or contributes to excessive overtime for workers who then simply don't have time to join unions. Or, common practice is a lack of long-term contractual agreements between brands and suppliers. And then factories really have no stability either and can't offer stable contracts to workers, which is a barrier for workers to organize, either a legal barrier, or they simply won't organize because it's a threat to their potential work and their livelihood. So those are four barriers, big barriers, but they can be addressed through a collaborative approach, a really supply chain approach, which I think is, what we want to talk about here, all the roles of the actors in the supply chain.
Thank you so much, Tina. We have about a half an hour left. We were planning to have a discussion because we wanted to hear from participants, your views, questions. We won't have as much time as we wanted because we're going to have second round of questions as well to our panelists, because we cannot finish only discussing the problem. We need to discussing the solutions as well. But I would suggest that participants, you can also use the chat function. I've seen already some comments coming through there. And if you do send questions through the chat, we can also select some questions of those for the end. But I would now like to start with our second round. And I will go back to Alex, and I will be very strict with the timing this time. So please try to stick to 4 minutes each, so everybody will have a chance to speak. And Alex, you explained before the situation in Mexico, and I was wondering if you could give us some positive examples of independent trade unions and social dialogue taking hold, and what are the reasons for that success? In the cases where there is success, what is the reason for this?
Again, there are not such kind of examples. We have one in the fashion industry, but it's gone. So I would like to spend a little time, to put in perspective another things, please. And I want to supplement this Tina idea about the brand's practices, to put in perspective that from the Mexican experience, the brands are part of the problems in many respects. They, in many cases, they create this kind of, I call it isomorphic mimetic of simulation practices. And second, they, most of the time, is they try to oversee supplier practices. At most, they just do in the first tier of suppliers. They don't know, even they don't want to know more beyond that. And third, global value chains, we need to be clear about it. They are about to reduce costs. Of course, they are about efficiency, quality, but mostly in this perspective, affecting social dialogue in CBE agreements and freedom for organizations. They are reducing costs all the time, and they put suppliers to compete against each other. They create this kind of adversarial relationships. And factories work as business units under incredible pressure, growing pressure. So from this, I would like to put in perspective some additional lessons and takeaways. We need global labor standards and binding mechanisms to enforce social dialogue in ILO fundamental conventions. It includes a minimum floor on wages and working conditions. We need to put in place mechanisms to voice internationally using digital displays. We need mechanisms to denounce and block even firms in the markets, and we need to put as ally customers in these equations. And another lesson, the last lesson that I want to put in the table, is that we need to work at this kind of industrial sectoral bargaining level, cross-national level. And to do this, we need this kind of geocentric, I will call it, approach, or at least regiocentric approach. But because keep thinking in terms of ethnocentric mechanisms alone is not going to work. We can be here another decade or 2 decades and come back and discuss the same, and we're gonna find the same main findings. And to end, I will say that we need to put in place, I will call it a new moral economy of inequality. The pandemic, the current global situation. Put in perspective that we need to create this social dialogue from a new, completely new basis. Government and employees need to consent to all these previous conditions, or pay the crisis, social unrest, pandemics that will be waiting for us in the next year on the next corner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm now going to come back to Kong and Cambodia. There was one question in the chat, which is interesting, which is the role of technology, such as worker voice apps in empowering workers. I don't know if that's something that you're using in Cambodia, but if you do, Kong, please let us know. Otherwise, I would also like to ask you what you see is the role of brands and governments in supporting social dialogue in your country.
Yeah, I'm not quite clear about the first question about technology. So can you repeat again? So
yes, it's a question in the chat, and we can discuss it later on, as others might have experience on this, because I wasn't aware of this tool myself. But in the chat, there is a question about the role of technology, and there is a reference to worker voice applications in empowering workers. But maybe this is not something that you in your union has experience with either, which is perfectly fine. But I thought it was an interesting question. So if you want to say something, that's fine. But otherwise, just let us know about your view on the role of brands and governments in supporting social dialogue.
yeah, so I think firstly, we have quite strong expectation and hope from the brand. So most of the time, in my experience, the brand, some of the famous brand quite supportive when we submit a complaint, when we want to get them intervene in our union, you know, busting cases. So it's quite successful for us for the last 10 or 15 years. I think we have less expectation from the government. So what we can do, we just try hard as much as we can to win the legal case at the level of the government practice. So I think some big brand has played quite a leading role, like H&M, like you know, Nike, especially in Cambodia. We have quite a few number of factory that we have quite good CBA for quite a long time. So I think when the brand is very clear on their stand and on their, you know, plan and what they really work with their supplier, so we mostly get quite a good result. So I think for example, now we have like H&M have signing a global framework that lead to create quite a platform for the social dialogue, which is coordinated by the brand. So this is one of the example that the brand can play a significant role and try to bring the supplier to understand and to, I mean, at the let's say at the global level, at the paper level. So it's still very good. It's very good. But most of the case when it comes to the practice, so then the brand need to work at more, I think, so at the practice level, because most of the brand they also like play as a victim. So they say they are not able to do anything. So because of, you know, like for example, I give you a very clear example now. We have an arbitration like second, like alternative labor court in Cambodia. So now we have a problem of the employer and the government. They are trying to work as much as they can to block the case to go to AC. And then some brand try to take the benefit, the advantage from this. Or they say there is no judgment from arbitration, so we don't know what to do. So this is the issue that we need to really look at, the practical, that the internal mechanism and the leading of the what you call plan, like the aim of the brand is not to how to say it, to go along with the weakness of the national system. So they have very well understood the ILO convention, the ILO quality, and they have very well understood their global framework, and they have very well understood about their code of conduct. And then most of the time they keep it aside when they face with the, you know, the weakness of the national legislation and national practice. So that is so mostly the broader speaking, they always say, yes, we support, you know, this CBA, we support this. And when we look at their factory, let's say they have 20 factory, they have only one CBA. So which is very completely different from what they're committed. So we have to link between the overall what you call, I don't know how you say, how do you describe it, like I don't want to say like window dressing or whatever, but but like link with the practice, you know. So I mean, this is the thing that we want to get from the brand. And for the government, I think they are play now is better than before. They are try to engage with the independent union. They try to dialogue. So they include the independent union in the national minimum wage body. So I mean, it's quite okay. But most of the case now, the national policy is getting improved. But at the factory practice is still very difficult to get the government to support. So we work very hard with the government in the last 10 or 15 years. We went on general strike, we put a lot of pressures, we get all these things. So now they change the national policy to some extent, but at the factory level, so that we try a lot of best practice way to explain them. So CKDU have a number of 6 or 8 CBA factory, which is very good in the country. I mean, we can say we are the outstanding CBA in Cambodia regarding the what they call peace or sustainability in the factory, working condition. So we use this what we call a best practice all this year long to explain, to convince the government. But the key that the government very concerned was we have to stay away from opposition party, right? So they really a bit scared of the power of the worker or independent union that will grab by the opposition party. So that's why they really very hesitate to open the space for this dialogue thing. So that's why the independent union like us, we have to very be careful, and we have to really work very hard to see that we are the one who only represent the worker interests. So that is the way we work here in Cambodia.
Thank you so much, Kong. I said I would be strict with the timing, but actually I wasn't. Yeah. But maybe we can come back to some of the issues. I'm really interesting to hear more about also how you're working towards the government. But I want to make sure that also Joy and Tina get to speak in this second round. Now I'm going to come back to the issue of suppliers, and unfortunately our representative Anna Patricia Sutanto from the suppliers, she's not with us, so we will just have to do without her. So instead I will ask Joy how you address the following issue, because sometimes there might be resistance to social dialogue from local management, arguing that social dialogue is not really part of their culture or the tradition. I'm not saying that all suppliers have this view, but it's an argument that is sometimes heard. So I was wondering, how do you deal with this? What can you do to overcome such resistance if it exists?
Yeah, of course. So what I hear a lot when I talk to other brands about issues around promoting social dialogue and freedom of association in factories is that they're really trying to sort of insist that suppliers should respect freedom of association and engage in collective bargaining. And I feel the notion of brands insisting suppliers is already a highly problematic sort of power imbalance, which is really prevalent in the industry. And I feel when you're trying to push your suppliers towards something without really trying to understand what the reasoning is behind their resistance or their hesitance, is the only thing that you're doing really is you drive a narrative that only sort of drives fake records, lack of transparency and lack of trust. So what you're actually doing is you're doing the exact opposite of what you're trying to achieve. So I think to overcome that resistance is to try to understand the resistance. So for example, in one factory where we produce, we've noticed a real hesitance from both sides actually, so from both workers and management. And when we sort of tried to dig a bit on understanding where that hesitance came from, we learned that the factory used to be unionized and that there were a lot of messy strikes in the past, that workers were fired, and it left a huge sort of trust gap in between the factory floor and the management. And in the end, it turned out to be that workers were scared to organize, but also the factory management was scared for them to organize. So kind of what was said by a previous speaker as well, that there was a lot of, that both sides were almost scared by the power of the other side. And yeah, it also turned out that both those sides were completely unaware of what constructive dialogue looks like and what an asset it could be to the workplace. So what we did there is we made contact with a number of local unions. We got one union in to really train both workers and factory management on those topics. And then we also did additional training on communication, like how do you have that constructive dialogue? Like if you need something from your management, or if your workers need something from you, and you might not be able to make it happen right away, but is there something that you could do already? Or how do you have that difficult conversation in a way that works for both sides? And yeah, so basically what happened is there were more regular meetings, there were more topics discussed, and bit by bit workers sort of opened up on what their needs were, from super small things to major things like workers and like wages and working hours. And yeah, factory management actually was then in a place to really step up and show that they wanted to communicate and to work with the workers and act on a lot of those things in cases, and other cases where things couldn't happen right away. They were able to explain that much better. And yeah, bit by bit, sort of trust was able to restore, and that kind of laid a foundation for workers to start organizing on. So this alone was a process of 2.5 years. So what Tina already mentioned, you cannot do this as a brand at a supplier that you use for 1 season or 2 seasons even. It's important that you have supply chains that are stable, that are long-term, and that you're able as a brand to offer your supplier also that long-termism in terms of your orders and your quantities and your capacities that you're going to give them. Because it's an intense project, and it's intense, yeah, a long time. It will take you a long time to really achieve something. And it involves a lot of trial and error. You know, there's no straight road to success here. It's very important to look practically, see where you can make a difference. Sometimes you take 1 step forward and then 2 steps back. But yeah, again, working on this standard helps you improve all other standards. And more importantly, it's worker-centric, and workers are in the end really in charge of their own rights, which is much more important than, you know, all of us having this beautiful discussion online. But it's really about them being able to advocate their own rights. And yeah, that's why you should work on this.
Thank you very much, Joy. Now I'm going to turn to Tina, and I'm going to ask you, what does Fairwear Foundation recommend brands to do to support social dialogue in global supply chains?
Great, thanks, Veronica. Yeah, so late last year, we actually launched a new freedom of association and collective bargaining policy and accompanying brand guide, which was based a lot on the information we had from the research and the partnership with Cornell, and also a lot of stakeholder consultations. And it outlines 6 clear steps for brands to take, which will support social dialogue. And these steps are really a mix of brands improving their own purchasing practices, as well as supporting their suppliers in implementation at factory level. So sort of a 2-pronged approach there. So one step in their own purchasing practices, which I touched on earlier, would be to ensure that their sourcing strategy privileges countries and suppliers where freedom of association is respected. So make this a priority in how and why you choose suppliers. To support suppliers and factory level dialogue, one of the steps we call out is calling on brands to support and finance training for both factory management and workers on how to engage in social dialogue. So Joy was just giving some examples of how they've done this. So really brands supporting their suppliers in learning how to do this, what social dialogue is and how to engage in this. And this shouldn't be a one-off training. This is not a tick box exercise, but an ongoing process of training and implementation, which the brand is supporting and checking in on. And it really requires some open dialogue and communication between brands and their suppliers, which is also a key part of Fairwear's approach, that this long-term relationship and this dialogue between brands and suppliers is really key to this as well. One of the steps is also calling on brands to engage directly with unions and to enter into binding agreements with them. So there was some chat in this I saw in the chat box as well, and Atit mentioned it a little bit too. Unions represent the workers and their interests, and by brands engaging directly with them, they can not only get a better understanding of the local situation, but they can commit to supporting the needs of the workers directly. So for example, this could be through global framework agreements, although as Atit called out, it's not just about signing them, it's fulfilling the commitments that are part of those agreements as well. Or through initiatives such as ACT that I saw there was some comments about, which really brings brands and unions together to promote industry-wide collective bargaining. And in these situations or in these agreements, brands should also make their own commitments which support workers' demands. So for example, brands can commit to covering the costs associated with increased wages that are negotiated through collective bargaining. So in this case, suppliers often fear engaging in collective bargaining because it could mean wages go up, and they're already working on really small margins. By brands entering into these direct agreements as well and participating and saying that, yes, we will support this and help cover costs if wages go up from negotiation, it gives everyone the ability to really negotiate a little bit more, and brands are stepping up and fulfilling part of their responsibility too. And one of the steps of the 6 also focuses on brands using their influence to promote improved policies and practices. So as the research with Cornell showed, government policies are often restrictive to workers' rights to freedom of association. There are violations taking place. We saw in COVID, there was a number of countries that used it as an opportunity to limit rights further. And brands sit in a position of power in the supply chain. And as such, they can and should use that power and influence to push for improvements. I have a 4-year-old son, and he's quite Spider-Man obsessed, and we always read books and it says, with great power comes great responsibility. That is true of the brands too. They hold a lot of power in the supply chain structure, and they have this responsibility to use it and use that influence for good as well. So especially when brands work collaboratively, this can have an impact. And we've joined forces with our member brands and other multi-stakeholder initiatives in the past few years to join campaigns and push governments to improve laws or address violations. And Jason highlighted an example earlier from Cambodia where our member brands and some other MSIs wrote letters to, engaged with the Cambodian government about some of the restrictive laws and the imprisonment of union leaders. And by adding the brand voice and the power to the call for reform, which included calls from countries and unions, et cetera, it sends a message that businesses will also not accept these kind of violations, and that there will be financial consequences for it, which governments might pay attention to. So brands adding their voice to that international call. And ultimately, in that case, charges against some of the union leaders were dropped, and we feel that brands speaking out so loudly contributed to that. Alex also mentioned earlier, sometimes you need an outside big bang explosion by someone else to push the needle to get improved policies or practices happening. There's a lot more concrete details in the other steps in our brand guide, and I can put that link in the chat if anyone wants to read or interested. And important to note, important for us, is that we also monitor our member brands' implementation of these steps through our brand performance check system, and those are published transparently online as well. So our member brands work towards making progress on this and really report on it transparently, which I think is key for change in the industry as well.
Thank you so much, Tina. We still have a few minutes for discussion, and I would like to see if any of the participants would like to take the floor. There have been quite a few comments in the chat, and there was one more I thought interesting about collaboration between the brands, because that is also important as suppliers are facing multiplied demands. Buyers might have different codes of conducts, and so how do the brands coordinate and work together? That's also an interesting issue. Is there anybody who would like to take the floor? You can use the raise hand function if you want to. Yes, Jason, I already had a question for you, so I will give you the floor anyway, because I thought that maybe you have something to say about this app for workers' voice, because I thought that was interesting, but you're also very welcome to make the comments.
Yeah, I had one thought quickly on technology's worker voice, and then another on a question about the role of governments and mandatory human rights due diligence. On the tech question, at Cornell we've done some work on this. We've looked at apps. Our conclusion isn't firm. There are lots of products out there, but the tendency is for apps to serve the needs of buyers as data collection tools, as grievance mechanisms. The evidence is not especially strong. Workers, particularly workers who are at the far end of a supply chain, where working conditions may be worse. We're talking about tier 3 or 4. It could be in agriculture or food production, for example. Workers there, when they have a complaint, are going to be reluctant to use a phone to make a complaint anonymously or by name to some unknown provider. Workers as they bring complaints, want to work through people they know and trust, and typically that's an organization that they build and lead themselves. That's not always present. So an app by which workers can complain can be a sort of release valve, but it's pretty risky for workers who don't know or trust the source of that. So a union or an organization that workers build and control by themselves it's an old technology, but it's still the best. The thought I had on the role of governments and mandatory human rights due diligence is really about data. At Cornell University, we're focused on data that comes from the industry, not just apparel, but other sectors, to give us a clearer picture of what's happening out there. The apparel industry, fashion, is notoriously opaque. So one of the things that we would call for as the European member states craft their responses to this mandatory human rights due diligence directive is a focus on the reporting requirements and moving from questions about what is brand X doing to advance freedom of association, for example, in its supply chain, a very sort of soft focus qualitative question, to a hard measure that asks the brands to disclose in a uniform way where they're buying. So by volume and by value, what are you buying and where? So we can see right at the start where brands are putting their money and whether or not there's a gap between what as Tina and others were pointing out, there's a gap between what the brand says about freedom of association, its importance for the brand, and where it puts its dollars. That would advance us, I think, pretty quickly. Another role so governments can insist on that as part of the reporting requirements. We want to focus on outcomes and impacts as opposed to the sort of soft focus qualitative stuff that makes its way into a lot of CSR style reporting. The other thing governments can do, and Tina also touched on this, is is press brands at home, buyers at home, on what it is they're doing to press for change at the national level. So if a Swedish brand is buying anything, apparel or another some other product in Cambodia or Bangladesh, how has that brand individually or collectively engaged with others to press the government to be clear about what sort of changes it wants and then to act on it? And of course, brands send the clearest signals by their sourcing choices. So if they're unhappy with progress on freedom of association or wages, for example, they have to be willing in the end to use that sourcing lever to demonstrate their seriousness. We saw this in Cambodia in response to the killing of wage protesters about 10 years ago. There was collective action by brands. The demands were relatively clear, and it led to a change in social dialogue, at least on the issue of wages. And where wages had been falling in real terms, the minimum wage had been falling in real terms over 10 years, it began to tick up. And that was at least in part because of what Alex calls a big bang. I mean, literally a bang, the killing of wage protesters, and the engagement, the collective engagement by brands and trading partners to insist on a change and then track it over time.
Thanks, Jason. And there was also one question in when you registered for this webinar, which I think would be important to highlight, which is because of this situation with the pandemic, and Jason, you also touched upon it at the beginning in your presentation, and I thought that was important to make the link with COVID-19, because of course that has had a tremendous impact on the whole garment industry. So the question we received was, can social dialogue provide key solutions to the increased stress that the supply chains are now under because of COVID-19? And I was wondering if one of our panelists, if anybody wants to pick up on this question. I mean, there is no easy answer, obviously, but just to see if there are any thoughts, anybody who wants to share his or her thoughts on this.
I can jump in just to say
then, yes, please do, and then I have Alex. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, great. Just to say simply that yes, I think actually only through social dialogue can this be really solved, and only through dialogue across the supply chain and really involving workers and involving employers and governments, because it's a complex issue and everyone has different points of view and perspectives that they can bring to constructive solutions to challenges. I mean, COVID is really, a microscope of the supply chain and the problems in it, but it certainly isn't going to be the last, pandemic or the last financial crisis or something. So we have an opportunity to examine what happened and bring together all players and really have social dialogue with workers, employers, and government sort of take the lead on how to move forward.
Thanks, Tina. Alex, you also have some thoughts on this question.
Yeah, just to add that we need to move from the national level. The pandemic COVID is not a national problem, it's a global problem. And we need to realize that the answers that so far everybody's doing is a national answers. So I said it before, the next pandemic, the next COVID is waiting for us, probably nobody knows, 1 year from now, 2 years from now. So and this applies for our social dialogue discussion. We need to move from the national level to this and put it in this perspective, global basic standards. Yeah, that's it.
Yes. I actually like to add something as well. So this, if I look into the impact of COVID on us as food supply and our supply chains, I really echo what Tina's saying, because it really pushed us to increase that type of social dialogue throughout our supply chains. I mean, we say supply chains, even COVID has even made it more clear than ever that it's an ecosystem and you need to keep all the pieces in place. And that is, COVID's been an extraordinary reminder to all of us, and that includes us, but also factory management and workers, that we need to have that dialogue to understand what is happening, what the consequences are of certain actions or certain things not working out. And I think it only increased the need to social dialogue, and also, going forward, it's one of the most important things that we should work on in order to make sure that supply chains and our industry stays resilient to upcoming challenges that we will face, whether that be a new pandemic or another crisis. It's kind of the glue that keeps us all together.
Indeed. Thank you, Joy. I think we will probably have to close here. We are already running over time. It's 2 minutes past 4, at least in Europe, in Paris, where I am. I would like to express a very sincere thanks to all our speakers, Jason, all our panelists. I think you have done a tremendous good job in explaining the situation and explaining the problems, but also highlighting what the solutions are and what can we do together, because that's really crucial. I'm just so sorry that we didn't get the perspective from the suppliers, because then we would have had really a complete picture. But that would be for another time. And also to stress that this is exactly what the global deal is about. We want to get the partners, the different partners, different stakeholders together to discuss the solutions. How can we together advance social dialogue? And the global deal can be a tool in this process. The global deal can be an initiative to help. And Fairwear Foundation is one of our partners. We also have several of the governments that we have been talking about today that are partners to the global deal, both Indonesia and in Cambodia, for example. These are governments that have joined the global deal, and they need to advance social dialogue. They also need to promote both social dialogue and the global deal at the national level. And we do welcome others to join: companies, brands, suppliers, trade unions, different organizations such as Fairwear Foundation and other organizations, and governments, of course. These are all organizations that we want to have as part of the global deal. And I think really the essence of the discussions today is that we cannot find the solutions, each one of us. One supplier cannot deal with all this, and neither can a brand. So we really need to come together to talk about this and see what we can do together. So I think the webinar today has been really useful for that. And I think that, and I hope that some of the partners have and participants have been inspired by the good examples we have heard, although sometimes it can be quite discouraging as well, because there are many bad examples as well. But we should learn from the good practices, the good examples, and we want to highlight them. So thank you again, everybody. And it was also great to see all the comments in the chat. You have been so active, and thank you to all of you that have stayed until the end. And as my last word would just be to make again some promotion for our next webinar, which will be held on the 1st of June. And then we will talk about social dialogue and gender equality. So please come back, please join those discussions as well. Thanks again, and bye everybody.